Hello and welcome to the Pandemic Baseball Book Club Author Series. I'm Jason Turbow, and I am really happy to talk today about this book, Cheated, the inside story of the Astros scandal and a colorful history of sign stealing. Welcome, Andy Martino.
Jason, thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this, for everything you do for authors. I've discovered this over the past number of months, and it's just great what you have going.
Well, thanks. It's really good to have you on board, and I'm excited to talk about this book, partly because I'm assuming I had the same reaction many people did, which is, oh, it's the Astros sign stealing scandal. I'm a professional baseball writer. I know all about it. I wrote a book that involves sign stealing. What am I going to learn? So right. I knew it was going to be well written.
Well, thank you. That's nice.
But I honestly, I didn't expect to learn nearly as much as I did about the depths of what went on. I mean, my eyes were really open to everything that was happening in that clubhouse. When you started this project, how confident were you that not only was there something there, but that you could find it? How much of this did you use to sell the book initially to Doubleday?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And I appreciate the compliment. That's a meaningful compliment coming from you. You obviously you're in the bibliography. You're one of my sort of baseline source materials at the beginning to understand the issue. So to have had you discover something is meaningful. How much of this did I use to sell the book? That's a good question. The proposal was the introduction, so I had the Yankee outburst about the whistling. And what got me started about this, actually, what led me down the path of writing this book was that I was covering the 2019 ALCS, Yankees Astros. And at that time, I did break the story that the Yankees were upset about the Astros whistling. So I had that, and all I had to do was flesh out. I had a news story about that. I had to go back to similar sources and flesh it out into more of a scene and get the color. So I had that. And then the Mets firing of Beltran and the Red Sox firing of Cora, being a daily reporter on the game, I was covering those things. So I can call somebody up and who's relevant to that news story and ask somewhat deeper questions that lead to more narrative writing, rather than just a news story about what happened. And that allowed me to probably prove to both myself and to the publisher that I could report out and write that way. And then there's certainly a bit of a fake it till you make it aspect to any of this, right? You write a proposal that was maybe 10,000 words. So they buy it and you think, okay, I better be able to write the book. So I was confident enough, and I would imagine you can relate to this. You kind of know, if you told me I had to write a biography of Tom Cruise tomorrow, I would say, well, I probably have the reporting chops, but I don't have any of the context. I'm not 100% positive I'm your guy for that project, but this was in the zone of the world where I covered. I had a ton of phone numbers from doing my normal day job, and I felt like I could most likely report this out. And then there's the pressure of getting that contract signed. And the fear, I wrote with fear of, which I would imagine is common-ish for a first-time author. Like, every word I wrote of that first draft was to not have Doubleday say, oh, God, this is not what we were thinking. Never mind. So that pressure drives you to get what you need.
Yeah, we should say off the top, for those who don't know, you cover the Yankees and the Mets for Sportsnet New York. Yeah. So you've got lots of contacts there. You talk about writing a biography of Tom Cruise, and it might be out of your wheelhouse, but presuming that Tom Cruise is in on it with you, you know that the story will be there and you just have to tell it.
That's right.
I don't think you were assured of that with this, at least as pertains to the details that weren't already in the public.
That's a good point. It was a stretch with my sources to think that I could get inside inside the Astros clubhouse enough to describe what was going on during this time. It was a stretch that I felt was plausible, though, because I know who I know. I know that I know how to ask questions of the pertinent people. And when you're reporting on something that is somewhat controversial, you can also leverage, and I mean that in not a, I don't mean the word leverage in a negative sense, but you can leverage people into confirming, denying. Once you find it's a ball that starts rolling down the hill. Like, hey, I know you don't want to talk to me, but I really need to know if this thing about you is true, in fairness. So please let me know. You get going on that in the reporting process. You're not threatening, hey, you better talk to me. You're saying, I really want to know from you. This is along the line that way, certainly in any investigative process. And I just felt there was just this feeling. It happened pretty quick. 'Cause again, I'm covering the Astros fallout. I'm covering how it pertains to the Yankees. I'm covering the Mets firing Beltran. And I just had this sense that I knew what calls to make. I knew what questions to ask. It's something I could pull off. You make a great point that I didn't have in the Tom Cruise analogy. I didn't have Tom Cruise quite yet. I didn't have the whole thing, but I just felt like I've been covering baseball long enough where if I set out to, I could figure out a lot of it. Now, you also have to be humble enough to understand that you don't get all of it. You get what you get. You get what people tell you. Obviously, there were people who didn't talk to me. There are things that could come out later that I didn't learn. I mean, hopefully any author is self-aware enough to know that you miss things as well. But I think I got enough of it where I was able to tell the story.
Of course. And I think the way you laid it out, telling the backstories of many of the principles involved, not only served to humanize them and really bring, I think, a balanced look to what was going on, but allowed you to cover 75% of your bases, even without knowing what you might get from those inside the clubhouse. You could report out a lot of backstory, and you did, in a way that I don't think anybody else did.
That's right. From a construction standpoint of the actual book, constructing the book itself, that is something that I knew I could do. Those chapters on Hinch, Beltran, Lunel, Cora, those are 5,000-ish word features, which is something I knew I could do. I've been writing features, obviously, for a lot of years. And, you're not writing them, obviously, to take up space, but they have that function as well. And that's nice. But I wanted to know, through that, and this sort of guided me into the more investigative section of the book, how did these three people, who I find to be and believed to be decent people, end up in this terrible scandal on the wrong side of a clear ethical line? So the feature chapters about their background weren't merely intended to just say, who are these characters we'll be learning about later, but it was like, I really wanted to figure out, like, how does this happen there? But for the grace of whoever you believe in, go any of us. How do you end up here? How do you get in the wrong culture, in the wrong moment, in the wrong time where this can happen? So I felt like I had to go back to their childhoods and trace it in a relatively concise way, of course, but really try to understand who these people were and how this happened. So that allowed me to do a lot of the original reporting. And, baseball is a pretty small tent in the sense of the actual people that work in it and have information and know what happened. So once you're talking to people about one thing, you can talking to them about another thing, and they know who else you should be talking to. And again, like I used before that, and now the ball just gets rolling down the hill. I mean, you look how small the world is. There's so many coincidences in the book, like Brody Van Wagenen, who's AJ Hinch's a college roommate at Stanford, and the left fielder, Hinch is the catcher, and they're best friends. Just so happens to be the GM of the Mets who has to fire Beltran almost 30 years later. That's just how small of a world this is. This guy my book is not about Brody Van Wagenen, but he just keeps popping up in it because baseball is a small tent. So you're talking to people about this stuff, and many of whom you already know. And some of the tougher questions and some of the feature questions start to mix pretty organically.
Yeah, and as an interviewer, that actually is very helpful to kind of ease into the tougher questions by saying, tell me about your childhood.
Right, exactly.
With legitimate purpose.
Right, exactly.
So before we get into Astros specifics, let's talk about sign stealing in general. I know, my book, The Baseball Codes, came out in 2010. I was researching it for years before that. And even as an established sports writer at that point, I learned so much about sign stealing that I didn't know before.
Mhm.
Did you go kind of through that same process as you were opening up the door into what exactly happened? As a professional sports writer yourself, learning, oh my God, these are things these guys do that they all know about, and somehow, I and most of my colleagues in the press box did not know about.
Oh yes, and that was one of the great joys of doing this, and I'm sure you found this too. You can watch on television, you can watch on the press box, you can watch baseball 5 days a week or more from childhood and miss so much of what's going on between these guys on the actual field. If you're not clued into it, if that language is not explained to you, you're not going to necessarily figure it out. So, talking to people just about what is a sign sequence, what's chase two? Oh, I see. You put down the two, and then the next finger is the pitch. But I didn't know most of this stuff, and that's covering the game day in and day out. That's not what you were writing about or reporting on from when you're covering a beat or writing columns or writing features. That's just not what you're seeing, and your eye usually as a sports writer, frankly, isn't that sharp to that level of the game. There are few sports writers who can really see that. John Harper in New York is one of them, a longtime Daily News columnist, sees the game kind of like a scout. But most of us know how to report, but don't necessarily have that eye to that degree. So that was just deeply fascinating. And that's why, although it's a controversial topic, I think a love letter to the game, and that sort of strikes people. What do you mean? It's called Cheated. And it's because this game, you just learn so much about how beautiful it is on so many different levels. Like, it means something for the runner standing on second base to rub his hand across his jersey, take a step off the base, either to the right or the left, and the hitter to say he wants it, sign or doesn't, by touching the brim of his helmet, say. It's indicators. It's so complex. And that was just a lot to learn. And just a real pleasure. And it enriched my experience of watching the game forever now, because I can see this stuff. I was so proud of myself. One of my sources for the book and I were texting during the 2020 postseason. The Rays were playing the Astros, and I remember going, "Holy shit! They just changed their sign sequence with no one on second base. They still suspect the Astros." And the guy's like, you're getting it, yeah. So it's like, I saw that, and then that's like, it's almost like your eyes are open to a whole other level of the game.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching a game last weekend. I thought of your book. The catcher drops down a set of signs,
Yeah,
waits a beat, drops down another set of signs, waits a beat, drops down another set of signs. I'm like, I never saw that 5 years ago. It's a whole new world.
That's right. And the great thing about baseball, one of the great things is that it's got this placid surface that obviously the uninitiated can consider boring. But if you're willing to really lock in on it, there are so many different levels of things going on that is just endlessly interesting.
Yeah. Did you have kind of that guru figure, that the conversation that helped you truly understand what was going on in a next level way?
It was a few different people. Some of them were the sources on some of the more controversial stuff. There were a few people I was really lucky to have, colleagues at SNY, Jim Duquette, who's a former MLB GM, works with me at SNY. He's on Sirius XM, just kind of a general voice about baseball now, and is a really good guy who I was always able to say, I heard this. Does this work for you? Does this make sense to you? Does this sound like someone's, trying to bullshit me, or does this? So he was great. Todd Zeal and Ron Darling, who I work with, are great. So I'm very fortunate to have had a couple of people who've been either executives or players who I could do, like, does this pass the smell test kind of questions? So yeah, that was lucky. There wasn't one person, but to piece it together from a few. That's the thing too about reporting a book. So many people are so generous with their time, whether it's people like I just described who will take your call, like, hey, I'm investigating this team. They claim that this is what happened. If you were the GM, is that believable? To, like, people really putting themselves on the line to tell you, like, hey, I was on the Astros and here's what we did. Please protect my identity. You just really end up so grateful for the people that take that time and trust.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable how much you can get from those kind of sources.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the spirit of protecting people, not necessarily anonymously, but in presenting a balanced approach, I think you reflect the existing fine line between what's acceptable sign stealing and what's not acceptable sign stealing.
Mhm.
Was that a difficult line for you to navigate?
Yeah, not really, because there's a quote in the introduction from Ty Cobb where he basically says, if you can figure out signs with your own eyes, that's cool. If you're using an outside device like a telescope, that's bad. So really, if it's Ty Cobb saying that, if it's the 51 Giants doing that with a telescope, and then if it's the Astros subbing in a high-speed camera or the Hawkeye replay feed from center field, it's kind of the same principle. So that one actually boils down fairly easily. Uh, at least the way I interpreted it and saw it, uh, on the field of play, crack the code from second base. From the dugout, if you see something that the pitcher's doing, that's fine. That there's an art and a skill to that. But if you're going outside the field of play, that's bad. And that's actually seems like it's been a pretty consistent principle for over a century.
Yeah, there was actually a relief pitcher with the Expos who could see the signs from beyond the outfield wall while he was in the bullpen. And no one took issue with it because his eyes were that good. So that was actually the leading question, because it is a very clear line for you and for me and for most of the people who watch. But it was much less of a clear line for the Astros, who seemed to rationalize what they were doing in all sorts of ways to make it acceptable. Like they just kind of pushed that window of opportunity toward the cheating end of the scale.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's a lot of rationalization going on. There was some legitimate, like, hey, this is the sign stealing era. Why us? So one question that I really had, and really was a central question to how the book was framed, was, were they worse or were they the ones who got caught during those years? And like, I've got people inside that team that now say, we thought we were part of what was going on. We now realize it was worse. I don't know that they're all there. And I don't claim to have talked to, I can't, this is the most specific I can be about, obviously, who I talked to and who I didn't, but I will not claim to have been able to speak to every single member of the 2017 Astros. But I'll say, I certainly know that there's a variance of opinion still of how bad it was. Some acknowledging, some a little more defiant still. But yeah, there was rationalization going on that way, that's where Beltran was coming from. Carlos Beltran was coming from a lot. Like, hey, we were cracking codes in the Yankees replay room couple of years ago. We're doing the same thing, and the way we're getting it to the hitter is banging on a trash can. Like, come on, what's the big deal? And there are players and people in the game who feel that way, but it doesn't really hold up, as you know, as for the reasons that we just discussed. They were worse. What they were doing was considered cheating. Confidently, I can say the majority of people in the game would think that was over the line, and the rage that people felt towards them. Well, I'm going to tell Cody Bellinger or Aaron Judge or whoever else that they're wrong. I mean, these are the guys who play the game, and they felt that it was morally wrong what the Astros did. It's not really my judgment or your judgment.
Exactly. I take the same stance on my ongoing coverage of the unwritten rules. I'm not really weighing in on it so much as I'm reporting its existence in the modern game. So, I mean, what struck me as one of the characteristics of the dividing line was, we know the broad strokes. We know that they were looking at video close to the dugout, banging on a trash can to alert the hitters for breaking pitches. But as I learned through your reporting, there was a monitor right behind the dugout that was ostensibly used for video review, where players could go look at video of their previous at-bats to figure out what was going on, perfectly legal. And there was a secret toggle that would allow the user to switch to the center field camera, which very few people knew about.
I think that was original reporting in the book. Yeah. It was like there was an IP address you could put in to switch between the two. That was a difficult thing for me to pin down because I was fortunate to have built up enough sources to tell me like what happened, but I wasn't quite understanding, and I'm not the most technical mind. It's like the Edgertronic camera, which takes 1,000 frames a second, is used to help pitchers improve their grip on their breaking ball, and is used to help hit. Beltran kind of innovated the use of it to now help hitters on their swings, and they're using that. And initially they were like, hey, our replay room at Minute Maid Park is too far down the hall to do this kind of legitimate work in game. Can we please have a video annex behind closer to the dugout? And the front office, or most of the members of the front office, were actually like, yes, of course you can have it. And I've talked to people who I trust in that Astros front office of that time who were like, we didn't think it was going to be for sign stealing. We were thrilled that our players are buying into the use of this edutronic camera. And, a couple of years ago, Astros players had been openly hostile to the front office's desire to bring more technology and analytics innovation to the game. And now Beltran and his new group are buying into it. This is great. But there were enough people in the leadership group working in the replay room and players who knew how had the tech savvy and the intent to, exactly as you said, create kind of a toggle where you could, the way it was explained to me was that you could type in an IP address for either the Edutronic, which is not used to pick catcher signs. It's 1,000 frames a second imaging. It's not the same thing, but the Hawkeye camera, the regular camera from center field, obviously gives you the live feed. And that's how they were able to switch back and forth. And as I said, it was hard for me to nail down because I'm asking people, sources, like, well, I don't get it. If it's for the Edutronic, how's that for sign stealing? It's like, no, it was the Hawkeye. What do you mean it was the Hawkeye? I heard it was the Edutronic. And honestly, finally, towards the very end of me writing the first draft and not being satisfied with this, I was like, would you please just, to someone, would you please just tell me how this works? Okay, fine. It was an IP address thing and you toggle between the two. So that's how they did.
So it was really just your frustration mounting with your sources because you knew something was there.
You read your own copy and you're like, this doesn't quite track. Like you're thinking, you put on your editor hat and you're like, if I'm editing this, I'm like, how did they do this? What do you mean? Because on the one hand, I'm writing that it was for the use of the Edutronic camera and it was legit. And on the other hand, I'm writing it was for sign stealing. And I was troubled by the fact that I wasn't quite understanding this. I wasn't able to quite, fully connect those things. So yeah, sometimes you develop these relationships with people and you're like, just tell me, and finally, sometimes they do.
Yeah. I mean, and as you say, most members of the front office were not aware of this. Do you know who?
And I accept that.
Do you know whose idea it was, or are you able to say whose idea it was?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple different pieces of it. There was a guy named Derek Vigoa who pitched the idea of Code Breaker to Jeff Lunau in late 2016. That was blown into a big thing when it came out. But really, it was an intern who had the idea to log sign sequences into a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet. Lunau claims that he never knew it was used for in-game sign stealing. It's never been conclusively proven that he knew or didn't know that it was used for in-game sign stealing. If used before and after games, it's perfectly legal. You're just trying to figure out sequences for an upcoming pitcher, say. So that's what he says he thought they were doing. As far as getting the new monitor, that was Carlos Beltran's idea with Alex Cora pretty involved. And with support from Derek Vigoa, who I just mentioned, and Tom Kochvaser, who was working in the replay room, were all kind of involved in that process.
It's a small circle, a smallish cadre. You do write that then Diamondbacks manager Buck Showalter recognized the system almost immediately. Of course, not the mechanics of it, but the fact that something was there. The very first night the banging happened.
Right.
Which
May 26, 2017, I believe. Yeah. And it was like, they've got something. We know they didn't took them a couple of years to figure out exactly what it was, but Showalter knew something was up right away.
Did you find out how that was?
How he knew?
Yeah.
What I knew, well, he's a guy who, Showalter's a guy who's got one of these very high baseball IQs, great attention to detail. Before every game that he has ever managed, probably, he looks around for espionage, signs of espionage. Like, he looks at the base coaches. Are they doing anything funny? Are they looking in anywhere they shouldn't be looking? He tries to find the chain of command on the signs. Because, sometimes a manager will give the signs to the third base coach. Sometimes he gives Deke signs and the bench coach gives the real signs. There's all things like that. So Buck's a guy who tries to figure all that out prior to every game. And he just also has an eye that's sharp enough where if a guy's like really taking a confident swing on an off-speed pitch, like time after time, he's just going to know. he's going to know there's something going on. He's got that kind of awareness.
Yeah, that's right. I thought about an interview I did with ex-Red Sox pitcher Al Nipper for the baseball codes, and he said, when you're throwing a bastard breaking ball down and away, and that guy hasn't been touching that pitch, but all of a sudden he's wearing you out and hanging in on that pitch and driving it to right center, something's wrong with the picture.
That's right, exactly. You don't have to hear the trash can or know the details to know, like, all right, they're up to something. And there then were years of this, obviously. Teams were so convinced the Astros were up to something. It just took Mike Fiers going on the record to really blow it up.
Yeah, I mean, this is a later question, but you brought him up. Were you able to speak with Fiers?
I just feel like I have to give a blanket. I can't say who I did or didn't speak to, because if you say did or didn't, then there's a guessing game that can start with who did you. And there's so many people who trusted me to take the information that they gave me anonymously and weave it into the narrative that I just decided the only way I can really be the only way I can truly follow through to the promise for anonymity is to just never say anything about who I did or didn't talk to.
That's fair. The only reason I brought up Fiers is because he's the one to go on the record about all of this.
And that's fair. And obviously you see he's not on the record in the book. And he plays a very important role in the history of the game, because this had been reported before. A lot of people forget. Jeff Passan, when he was at Yahoo, broke the story of the trash can scheme during the postseason in 2018, a year before the Athletic story. But it's just the value of having someone on the record that has to be dealt with at that point, basically.
Absolutely. So let's talk Jose Altuve. He was the face of this scandal for a long time, being, as he was, one of the most prominent Astros. But as it turns out, your book tells us that he actually didn't want the signs and got upset when people fed him the signs against his express instructions.
That's right. When the trash can would bang, he would glare into the dugout. Guys would go, "Oh, he doesn't want it." They'd scramble. There's a lot of, there's guys you talk to, guys who just don't want it. They don't want to clutter up their minds. I talked to David Wright, was one of the people in the book. And the reason I say I'm comfortable, despite what I just said, is that, some people were just helpful giving me background. I put them in the acknowledgments. David Wright, who I covered as a player, was one of them. And he was like, one time I got the sign early in my career. I thought it was going to be a fastball. I said, well, wait. He thought it was going to be one thing. He took an embarrassing swing on the other thing. And he's like, never again. I just want to see ball hit ball, So a lot of guys are like that. Altuve was not one of those guys who wanted to sign. Now, there were bangs during his at-bats. Some of them could have been unintended, as I just described. There are other reasons why guys on the team got the trash can bangs than just a changeup is coming. There was, I only want it in this count. I want location. Bang it when he's going to throw outside. All that. I don't report definitively whether or not Altuve, Josh Reddick, or Brian McCann wanted any of that. What I do report is that they didn't have very many at-bats at all during that season in which the banging corresponded with its typical pattern, indicating off-speed pitch, usually a changeup. It just wasn't like that for them. But again, there were other reasons why guys wanted the bangs. It wasn't just that straightforward always as a pitch.
Yeah. I mean, since your book came out, there's been various videos going around of Altuve at bat, getting a bang on his first pitch, glaring at the dugout, someone realizing, oh, it's Jose. They're not even paying attention to his at bat. They're just watching the signs and then slowly kind of backfilling what the player actually wants.
Right. Exactly. That video shows that the players were telling the truth when they said that he would glare into the dugout and be unhappy. But yeah, you're right. There's no way to know 100% what everybody. We would need a video of the guy banging the can. We would need a video of the guy looking at the monitor to know the full context of what's going on in a moment like that. But that video definitely tells you that Altuve was not happy to hear that trash can bang.
So there's probably no way to know unless Altuve himself told you or anybody else what percentage of his reluctance to get the signs was based on being a hitter and what percentage was based on some sort of moral stance.
Yeah, we don't know because he has taken a stance where he has refused time and again publicly to distance himself from his teammates on this, despite the fact that some of his teammates have defended him and said he wasn't part of it, both to MLB investigators, to me in reporting this book, and then I believe Carlos Correa did it on the record. Altuve won't himself say this was wrong. He's appears to be operating more in that very traditional baseball mentality of I'm not throwing my teammates under the bus publicly on this. So.
Which I can't appreciate.
Sure.
As far as that goes. There is some real tension between the pro-banging and the anti-banging factions, though. The guys who didn't want it really didn't want it.
That's right. And pitchers. So there are pitchers who believed it was wrong all throughout. And one of the reasons why it stopped, starting in 2018, they get to spring training. There's just not a lot of talk about it. It doesn't happen again. There's other stuff going on, but not the trash can. So I think it was just, it became a source of stress and in some corners guilt, and certainly in some corners tension. Look, AJ Hinch and Alex Cora were going at it at a bus ride late in the season, yelling each other's faces, and it wasn't about sign stealing, but that was an issue in which the two seemed to really disagree. So as with a lot of secrets, I think it probably festered and became more trouble than it was worth at a certain point, so they stopped.
Yeah, for sure. And later on in the book, you get into the not inconsequential detail of the fact that sign stealing was not Houston's only shenanigan during that course of time. They were allegedly putting extra mud on baseballs that they delivered to the plate umpire before they took the field, so that their pitchers would be more likely to get them mixed into the mix.
Right. MLB took that one seriously enough to create a small change that I don't know was known until I asked a question about it while I was reporting this out. But I found out that a Dodgers player took some baseballs that he thought were too dark and brought them to Dodgers management and said, these are I think the Astros are throwing different baseballs. So the way baseballs are mudded up, it happens in the umpire room. It's usually the clubby. The umpire's supposed to be paying attention, but he might just as easily be eating a sandwich or something. So, it's one of those kind of lax things. And from that point forward, starting in 2018, because of this complaint, MLB hung a poster with pictures of, here's how the baseball's supposed to look. This is too dark. So even that was enough to cause that little change. There were all the way down to 2019, and the long list of complaints / concerns the Tampa Bay Rays submitted to MLB before the division series against Houston in 19 was they thought, or at least wondered, if Garrett Cole and Justin Verlander had basically their own set of baseballs. And so, there's stuff like this going on, at least allegedly, incredibly, all throughout.
Yeah, I mean, at some point you get into the realm of gamesmanship. And, how different is it than, putting dimmer light bulbs in the visiting team's bullpen, or, the Metrodome reversing the airflow of the air conditioning system when the home team's at bat. Things like that. Things that no one would, necessarily get behind publicly, but I don't think would cause this level of scandal.
I think that's a good point. And so then you just zoom out to how other clubs felt about the Astros because of the big things that they did. And it means that everyone's pissed off at the Astros all the time. So then it's like,
that could have been the name of your book.
That could have been the name. You're right. And it was true. Like, there were a small group of clubs who were really on this too. The Rays, I just said, submitted those complaints. The Yankees complained a number of times. The Indians complained about them a number of times. And there was some frustration with MLB from those clubs during those few years, 17, 18, 19, that there wasn't more being done to take care of this team. So you make a good point. If the Astros are mudding up the balls differently with your clubby, if that's all a team was doing, that's probably gamesmanship, a little bit of a wink category of cheating. If you're doing it in addition to these legitimately unethical things, then that's the full context of it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up all these complaints. The Astros were investigated 10 times between 2017 and 2019.
Yeah.
Did you have access to the results of those investigations?
Some. I was briefed on some, like, for example, let's see, the one, I'm trying to make sure I answer this exactly accurately. So I'm going back through the investigations. I was told credibly that there were 10 investigations. I was briefed on a few, including having one that related on the incident between the Yankees and the Astros in 2018 at Yankee Stadium. I had that read to me by a source who was reading from the report, the MLB's internal investigative report. I had the Dodgers complaint against the Brewers that resulted in an in-game investigation. I was briefed on that. I didn't have access to every single one, and because some of these were pretty quick and informal. It wasn't always the Department of Investigations comes in, they make an official, they do an official interview process, they publish the results internally to MLB. Some of it was, hey, we think this is going on during this game. Can the MLB official on site please look into this right now? So some of it, and then there'd be maybe an email written up or something about the results. But there were different degrees of depth to depending on the situation. So no,
Sure.
and I haven't looked at materials from every last one of them. No.
I guess the real question is, did it result in any consequences? Was there any effect from these investigations?
Yeah.
Or did the league really find nothing? I mean, it seems like Major League Baseball's stance when it comes to steroids, when it comes to the current issue of sticky stuff up until literally this week, has been to try and ignore it and hope it goes away and only act if public pressure forces their hand.
Yeah. Well, there were no consequences during that time, to answer that question very clearly. There were tightening of rules and procedures that MLB hoped would take care of this issue. And nobody thought that a player like Fiers would speak on the record necessarily in that kind of detail, and that it would create that kind of scandal. So starting in 17, 18, and 19, there were memos issued, there were meetings, and there were legitimate measures taken. It was much harder to do this in 19 than it was in 17. You had these monitors, these people. The monitors is a confusing word in this because it means TV screens and people monitoring. So, but by 19, you had people in the replay rooms monitoring the activity there. So it was harder. Some of these, there were varying degrees of success. Like the guy at Fenway once was supposedly a Red Sox fan who was sitting on the steps watching the game. There were things like that. But there were also instances where one replay guy told me he just went on to Slack real quick to like message something to a colleague innocently and was written up to MLB for communicating during the game. So he had to be reprimanded. No Slack during games. You know, there was legitimately things like that. And MLB was trying to do that. They're trying to warn clubs. There was a meeting where Joe Torre and a couple of other MLB officials met with AJ Hinch, Alex Cora, Jeff Lunau, and Dave Dombrowski. Astros and Red Sox were about to play each other in the division series in 18. And Torre was like, none of this sign stealing shit. If you guys do this, eventually someone's this is gonna really come back and bite you, okay? Like, so they knew what was going on. They were trying to self-police it and get it to improve without having to have a big publicity scandal. And I guess in their defense, what corporation wants to generate its own scandal? You let the journalists do that for you if they can do it, right? They were hoping to clean it up more quietly. Now, I don't want to defend them too strongly on that because there are plenty of club officials from various clubs that feel like it went too slowly, and as a result, it blew up in their faces.
Yeah, and I think that even once it started to blow up, Major League Baseball was not necessarily the most proactive outfit, although it might have been beneficial for them on a PR front to have made public some of these things you were just talking about. Even if they weren't releasing all the details therein, saying, we actually are trying to do something about it, and here's what we're doing in broad strokes.
Yeah, you could certainly argue that. They at the time their mentality was just, I don't think they saw how big it was going to blow up. So I don't know that at that time they would have felt that was necessary. I'm just reflecting their perspective. I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but maybe they would argue that it's hard to anticipate a major scandal. Maybe they should have anticipated it. Maybe they did and made a poor decision. Those are all good questions. I don't subscribe to the fact that there was some massive cover-up of these things. I think it was more of a lack of proactiveness and really exposing everything in a hope that, as I said, that the tightening up of rules behind the scenes would eventually make it go away. And I think that that they're trying to learn from that with the current scandal. Not to jump ahead, but when you look at this foreign substances thing, they're trying to crack down before there's the major tentpole scandal like the Astros. That's a lesson attempting to be learned from the slow action on the Astros, trying to make sure that doesn't happen this time.
Right, and I think they're continuing to be opaque in a way that is not helpful to public perception, regardless of their intent behind whatever they're doing. Yeah, it's funny that your book just came out and you're already no longer the current scandal.
I know it's interesting. Baseball that tells you about the long history of gamesmanship / cheating in the game. It's part of it, and it's an interesting part of it, and it intrigues people. But you're right. It's just they'll be cheating some other way in 2025 that we don't anticipate yet.
Exactly. So for me, the most maddening aspect of this entire affair was the indignation with which the Astros issued their apologies in spring training a couple of years ago, just before COVID hit. They genuinely seemed like a team, as a full unit, that was not regretful for what they'd done so much as they were regretful for being caught. Did that strike you similarly?
It did, and I happened to be on my day job in Yankees camp in Tampa while those news conferences were going on. There was the first one where Jim Crane, Alex Bregman, and Carlos Correa basically gave a brief ostensibly apologetic statements with terrible body language, and it was clear that they didn't really seem sorry. And then Carlos Correa went on to defend what they did, claim they didn't have the signs during the World Series. They did, to say like, well, this hit, Correa broke down in an interview with Ken Rosenthal that appeared on MLB Network. He broke down, well, this is how we scored the runs. It was like a dribbler to the mound, then there was a throwing error, then there was a fastball, and how was this, that? And I remember being around the Yankee people, and they were like, bullshit. He hit that dribbler for the throwing error because he had to pitch 2 pitches earlier, and it changed the whole complexion of the at-bat. Like, you can't isolate it to the point of contact. But that was the rationalizing that Correa was doing in those statements, and that was off-putting, not just to fans, but to obviously other teams. The Yankees were indignant. That was the week that Cody Bellinger and Trevor Bauer went off on the Astros. It just wasn't passing the smell test even for fellow players. And that was significant to me. That was the first time in my career I'd seen guys who were in the same union and have more to unite than divide them generally, despite what team they play on. They share agents, they share common desire to on labor concerns and to make more money. And like, there's a lot for them to agree on generally. So to see them ripping each other was pretty startling.
Yeah, that for me was one of the things that brought this into the next level. You've got people inside baseball talking about topics that are exclusively raised behind closed doors. Yeah,
right. Yeah, it brought it all out, and that tells you the extreme level of feeling that they had. When Jim Crane said at that news conference that it didn't help them win the World Series, and they denied the Altuve buzzer thing. I was at Aaron Boone's spring training news conference that day, and Aaron Boone is the most even-keeled guy. It drives Yankees fans crazy sometimes how even-keeled he is. And he's like, what Crane said is a stretch. I have no idea if the buzzer thing really happened. It's like, whoa, buddy. The report said that the buzzer didn't happen. There you have the manager of the New York Yankees saying, I don't know if MLB's report was right. I mean, this is like, it got very intense in that way for a while.
Absolutely, especially around the Yankees camp with Aaron Judge losing out MVP to Altuve that year. And in retrospect, thinking about it now, Altuve might have gotten a raw deal in that argument, given that he didn't want the signs. He wasn't cheating in any way that we know of that would effectively have pushed him past Aaron Judge.
Yes, he may have, but at the same time, it's tough to start. I mean, the facts led to that being what it was about Altuve, and that's what's been understood. It's in the book, and that's great. But I can also very much empathize, as I bet you can, with Aaron Judge's perspective of like, it's not my job to cherry pick who was more guilty or not. I'm just mad at all of you. I get that too.
For sure. And I get like players not on the Yankees or the Astros were saying Aaron Judge should have won MVP and saying it publicly.
Yeah.
It was remarkable. And then we find out that the Astros continued to cheat past the scandal, just not with trash cans. You talk about the Yankees noticing, what looked like a flashlight in center field,
Yep.
waving and blinking in accordance with fastballs and curveballs. How prevalent was that to where you were going with this? How much was it reported prior to your book?
There was some reporting on that flashing lights incident in the 2019 ALCS. I had written about it that while the investigation was going on, that the Yankees had complained about that. There was a lot of reporting. I think New York Post might have been the first to publicly surface the buzzer allegation. So there was a lot of noise around that 2019 series, Yankees Astros, that was out. So I thought it was kind of my job to try to flesh out a little bit what I could, fact from fiction. And, I found that there wasn't really any credible evidence to support the Altuve buzzer thing, but Yankees people really did think that the lights in the scoreboard were blinking in a way that corresponded with the pitch selection. And also, by the way, the whistling thing, which I know obviously is on a different level from electronic sign stealing, but in game one of that series, the Yankees were complaining that the Astros were whistling on pitches, and it was explicitly barred. Joe Torre and his group had come into each manager's office that spring to say, among other things, no whistling. It was something that they were looking to crack down on. So Aaron Boone hears it, and he goes to the umpire and hey, this isn't right? Then, Alex Cintron, the Astros coach, and Phil Nevin are yelling, fuck you, blah, 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 at each other. There's the jawing that can happen on a baseball field. But at the end of that, the Astros strongly denied it. AJ Hinch called it a joke. MLB reporters, other than myself, were writing, there wasn't any evidence of whistling. MLB looked into it. Well, that was real. And what the Astros now admit, with some time behind them, is that Gary Sanchez, the Yankees catcher, was tipping the fastball by rising up higher in his stance, his crouch, and that they were whistling on fastball. And that's of a different degree than some of the other stuff they did, but it's actually cheating. It's not allowed. So there was so much of that, so many different levels, accused and real, going on in that Yankees series.
Exactly. It reminds me of, one of the classic stories of sign stealing involving the Yankees. Former pitcher Bob Turley was really good at decoding signs, to the point where they would stick him in the coach's box during his off days when he wasn't pitching, and he would whistle when a breaking ball was coming. And I believe it was Jim Bunning on the mound. Mickey Mantle was at the plate, said, if I hear one more whistle, you're getting knocked down. Sure enough, there was a whistle. Mickey got knocked down. Next batter is Yogi Berra. He yells at the mound, hey, Jim, he's whistling, but I ain't listening.
That's great. I forgot that story. I mean, but there you go. So in one small thing, and I'm not saying this is bad, but one very small factor in why this whole scandal was allowed to blossom is, by the way, the fact that pitchers don't do that kind of self-policing anymore. It's obviously bad to throw a fastball at someone's head, but that is one way that this used to be cleaned up in game. If you heard stuff like that, and why guys might not want to do it. A pitcher told me this was on the cutting room floor of the book. But there was a pitcher who pitched in the 80s who told me that he was pitching against the Cubs. Andre Dawson was up, and Ryan Sandberg was on second base, and Sandberg was clearly giving the signs to Dawson from second, which, again, if you can get away with it, cool. But the pitcher turns around, he goes, hey, Rhino, you do that again, I'm going to hit him in the fucking neck. And, okay, all right, So, again, nobody should be hit in the neck with a baseball. But the fact that nowadays that guys don't pitch inside, guys don't do that, there are ejections and warnings, is one more factor that led to this becoming more common.
Absolutely. There was also a way for the opposition to see Ryan Sandberg signaling from second base in a way that they could not see the Astros signaling because of this next level. And I think that's a big difference as well.
That's right.
And toward the end of the book, you get into an unrelated scandal, which is Brandon Taubman going off on this, vocal support of convicted wife abuser Roberto Osuna in front of a group of female reporters. That's shitty behavior, but it's really unrelated to the rest of the book. What was your thought process in placing it where you did?
And including that? That's an interesting question. That wasn't Well, one of the things that was very important to me to portray by way of explanation of how this happened was the culture of the Astros generally under Jeff Luhnow, the GM. And uh, there was a question that was very commonly asked when this all came out, like, what did Luhnow know? And while that's not an irrelevant question, it's one that I thought turned out to be a little bit of a red herring, because the point wasn't what did he know? The point was he created a culture that was so paranoid, obsessed with innovation, and amoral that his employees intuitively knew that you could try to pull something like this under him. And that extends to a lot of different ways. And one of the most telling things that happened during Luhnow's time there, telling about the culture, was when he was considering trading for Roberto Ozuna. His baseball operations group, which included Brandon Taubman, was like in a meeting, was like, please don't do this. Like, there are details that we think we know about what happened that are really, really bad. And we don't think he's someone who should be here. And Luhnow snaps at them. I don't want your baseball opinion. Excuse me. I don't want your moral opinion. I want your baseball opinion. He goes off by himself. He actually made the trade by himself, comes back in the room. I traded for him. And everyone is like, oh. So Brandon Taubman's a guy who is just, in that moment, a victim of this culture. He didn't really want to do it. Then Luhnow leaves town, actually, after the trade, goes to Mexico on vacation. Taubman has to explain it internally to people while not agreeing with it. Then, you flash forward another year, this strange thing happens where he gets drunk in a clubhouse celebration, says, I'm so fucking glad we got Ozuna. Sort of targeted at one female reporter who had been tweeting criticism of the team for making that move. He loses his job. Well, I think that was a telling episode about Jeff Luhnow's generally high pressurized and amoral culture. And while that wasn't about sign stealing, it told you what it was like to work there. And also, that was a very intense time where the whole organization was about to fall apart. And that was one of the final nails in the coffin, if you will, about a month before the Athletic report and Mike Fiers dropped. There was that Taubman incident. So it just was sort of in that storm of everything that was about to come crashing down with the Astros too, almost from a narrative standpoint.
Yeah, it's a great answer, and it fits right into to this impression I got from your book, which is it's a book about a team full of cheaters, and yet there's no real bad guy in it, save for maybe Jeff Luhnow. Right? Everyone else is humanized. Their motivations have kind of been spelled out very clearly to the point where you might not agree with them, but you can appreciate Carlos Beltran as a player and as a human being while disagreeing with the stance he took in this instance. And I think it seems like you took great care to make that so.
Well, thanks for noticing that, because I did, and it's about a culture too. And even with Luhnow, who, I had to obviously I wrote what people told me about him and what I learned to be true and confirmable. But even he was someone who was polarizing. He has his loyalists. Like, this guy's brilliant. He gets results. He's actually great and affable and fun to have a beer with. And then you have the people that are like, he does not know how to relate to people. He doesn't respect any who have come before him in this game. He's throwing out the baby with the bathwater with baseball traditions. And so that he's very, very polarizing, and did build a culture that was like that. And I appreciate your comment, because there's always this issue of fault that people want to know, right? Even when, like, covering the Yankees on a daily basis, the Yankees are bad right now. Whose fault is it? Should they fire Cashman? Should they fire Boone? Well, maybe they should fire somebody, but sometimes it's not that simple as in terms of whose fault is something. There's a culture, there are factors, there are a million reasons. And that's the beauty of having the space of a book, is that you can hopefully lay that out. Is here's how it happened without pointing a finger of judgment. Judgment is appropriate at times, of course, but
fun to be judgy,
right? And we all do it sometimes to feel better about ourselves. But the fact is that it happened because of a culture that was there. And yes, Luhnow is the one, as the leader, who is most responsible for that culture.
Yeah. So I'll close with a question that you might not have an answer to, given that it falls outside the scope of your reporting. But since the time of this Astros team, they've turned a corner. They brought in Dusty Baker, clearly trying to make a change. Do you know how much things have changed, or not?
Good question. There was a complaint about them that I referenced earlier that I noticed from watching the Rays Astros series last year. And I was like, oh my God, are the Astros still doing it? Because the Rays are defending basically against electronic sign stealing. And the story that I ended up writing was from the Rays perspective that there wasn't any evidence that there was something going on anymore. It was just like, why not be careful? In the sense of covering all your bases because it's happened in the past. There is no evidence, there have been no accusations that I've heard of that these things are still going on with the Astros at this point. I mean, they would have to be insane to be. I can't imagine if you get caught doing something like that again. So despite some of what you noted or the rationalizations they've had for past behavior, no, I certainly haven't heard anything about current behavior.
And I'll tell you, I mean, I did not expect this to come full circle, but I asked you about, your guru, the one guy who might have opened up some doors of understanding for you. Dusty Baker was that for me with the baseball codes.
Oh, interesting.
Very early on, and one of the things he was very clear about was go steal signs all you want from the base paths. Once you're caught, you got to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And so clearly, he's taken over a team that has been caught, and now has to respond accordingly.
Yeah, and he's a great example of a traditional baseball guy who's able to hold that nuance and complexity of you can have gamesmanship, you can take it up to a certain line, you can cross the line for a second, but don't go crazy like the Astros did for a couple of years there. So you're right, with him as the manager. And, another guy who's spoken of that way is Dave Roberts with the Dodgers, because there are accusations against the Dodgers, and the Dodgers lived in a little bit of a gray area as a very tech-savvy contemporary team. But more than one person told me they call him Doc. Doc Roberts would never allow that to go that far. No, there's a lot of guys that really do just feel it's a moral thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Andy, great talking to you again. The book is Cheated. If you were not turned on by this conversation, I don't know what's going to turn you on. It goes deep and it's fascinating. Great job on this. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
That was really fun. I'm very grateful to have done very similar interviews about this. And this one was a breath of fresh air talking about the craft a little bit. So I really enjoyed it.
Excellent. All right. Well, hopefully we'll get to touch base at some point later in the season about other interesting topics.